So what I want to do now is I want to do an example of how to set something up using the networking. So I'm just going to make two players uh, and then have the ability to network bullets being shot between them. So let's go ahead and get started on that. So I'm going to create a player. We're going to add the network transform. Okay, and then that adds our network object, which means it's going to be networked across the network. Okay, and I need client authoritative because this is a player. All right, so the player is going to have control over his own player. So he'll be able to move around, do whatever. And if you watch the other video, you have to understand that you have to be very careful with authority. You don't want other players being able to control things like bullets. You wouldn't want that. You'd only want the uh, player to control the player, and not bullets, because bullets could be moved anywhere in the universe. You don't want that. So we're going to call this player. 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 All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this player, we're going to create a prefab out of it. Okay, back up here in examples, we're going to go and we're going to grab the network manager. We want to take this out of here. We're going to add the time manager. This way we can adjust the settings if we need to. And we're going to take our player and we're going to drag the player into the player spawner. All right, so now the networking is set up. So when I start the game, it'll run. Got there. All right, so now what we need to do is we need to have a projectile. Okay, so we're gonna do a circle, and we'll just do a 0.2, 0.2, make it a nice small little circle here. We're gonna add a transform to it. Okay, same thing here, except for this time we're going to uncheck the client authoritative because we want the server to manage the projectiles. Now, there's a couple of different ways you can do this. One is to use the transform, and another is to use physics and sending an RPC and saying, hey, fire this in this direction, and then it just goes, right? And then once it hits whatever, it destroys. Because if you have something that's static and you don't need to use a transform, go ahead and don't use a transform. So if you have one of those games where you have like a thing here and a thing here, and then it's firing into the middle, and that's the only place it can go, then just go ahead and skip out on the transform and use the physics to just go ahead and fire it off. So, all right. So what we're going to do here is we're going to take our circle and we're going to rename this projectile. All right. We got a projectile now. So down here on our player, we're going to add a script machine. Okay, we're going to do a new script machine, and this will be the player. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is we're going to want to have a way to start firing our projectiles. So let's do on mouse input. Oops. So we want to hold down our button. Okay, and now we need to make sure that only my player can fire this. So we're going to do is owner. If this is true, okay, and I want to send the position of my mouse and where we're going. So we're going to set a position for the projectile and where it's going to go. So we need to get the mouse position. If I mess something up, I'm doing this all in one take. So sometimes I get a little wiry. So we'll see how it goes, right? So we're going to do screen to world. to world point. Okay, and we're going to grab the main camera. Okay, so now what we have to do is we have the position that we're wanting, which is going to be our mouse. Okay, and we're going to um, want to make sure that everything is done on the server, right? We don't want the player having any control over what happens to the position of the object that's being fired and where it's going. So we're going to do a CMD master, because remember the command now, this is sending to the server. This is going to tell us where we want to go. So we're going to take this, we're going to round it to a vector 2, because my setup is for vector 2s on this array. And we're going to do null, 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 create a list. I want my first object, and then null. All right, so this is going to be fire. All right, so now what we have here is the player is going to hold down the left mouse button, and it's going to rapidly fire projectiles as fast as possible on update to whatever mouse position I have, but it's sending those positions to the server. And of course, you would add a cooldown in here if you want to, if you're going to you just want to slow it down, so maybe like 0.2 seconds, so it's not on update, because you can do on update and it works really well. It's just once you get 150 players and they're doing it on update firing, it's going to slow down a little bit. So you got to make sure you kind of account for performance. All right, so next, now we have our fires coming in. We're going to do a custom event. Okay, we're going to do this, and for my setup, it's always 8. When I spoke about the other scripts on the other video, I set them up so everything is always the same everywhere. I don't want to have to go and try and figure out, what custom events do what. Everything is the same. It's very consistent and very easy to use. So now we're going to do is server. Okay, we got to make sure that only the server can fire this off. Okay, and then now we have our projectile position where we're going to go. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I want to get item. So here's the position coming out, and then I want to instantiate. And there's a couple of ways of doing this too. So I could do it with physics. I could do it with. I'm just going to add a script to each one so it's moved toward. And once it gets to the position, just destroy itself. But you can do it any number of ways. It's really it's one of those things where each person is going to be different. There's so many ways to do any one thing. It's pretty much impossible to say, all right, this is what I'm going to do. So I'm going to set an object variable. So this is going to be dest position. Okay, and this is the destination position. Oop. This is going to be my position. That's wrong right there. So this is going to be this is where it's coming from, right? So this is where your mouse is going to be pointed, and this is your current position, and this is where we want to fire it to. So we're going to set the destination position. All right, and then we're going to network spawn this game object here. Okay, and then we got to remember our local connection is for this player, and remember all this happens on the server, so you're using the server connection to spawn everything. So a player on the client side cannot spawn, so you got to keep that in mind. So let's make sure that this works real quick. Take a real quick run on it. Okay, no CMD master. Oh, see what I did there. All right, so from the other video, we have these 2 scripts. So I have to have this CMD master because I was trying to send a command. And if we remember what this script does, It's this script here for the custom events. So you got to make sure that's attached to anything you want to send a CMD or RPC through. All right, so let's save this, run this. Now we should have some projectiles popping up. Let me do it. Let's do a destroy here. Not component. Actually, I need to despawn, not destroy. I need to let's set that up on the object itself. Let's do that real quick first. We got to make sure the bullets are actually going to move because I didn't actually set that up, did I? What a day. Okay. So here we're going to add a new script. We're going to do this. We're going to call this projectile. All right. So on start, oh, shouldn't have deleted that. Okay. So on start, typically what I do is I always add a little bit of a timer here. Just to give it time for the server to send the RPC, so 100 milliseconds. That should account for most latency across most networks. You know, internet has gotten a lot faster, so you don't have to have these 300 millisecond ping times anymore and stuff like that. So it should be pretty quick. So what we have to make sure is that this, again, is a server object, right? So the server is the one moving everything. So we're going to do a is server because we don't want the player to try and move what's happening. So we're going to do if statement, and we're going to say after 100 milliseconds, we're going to go ahead and check if you're the server. If you are the server, I want to do a while loop. So I want to get my position. If this position is not equal to the, let's see, we're going to do a, what was it, dest position. Get object variable. Okay, and is this equal to this? And this one was rounded, so we got to make sure, because what came into that position for this one was actually rounded, so we got to make sure that they're the same. So as long as this is actually not equal, we're gonna, well, I guess it's not equal. As long as they're not equal, I want this to be true, and then I'm going to do another wait for seconds here. And this while loop, they actually tell you in the documentation not to use these. These are all I use. I don't use anything. I typically never use an update. It's one of those things where I may have 10,000 nodes in my game, and I'll have 1 or 2 updates. Everything else is run by custom events and triggers. So if it's not meaning to run, it does not run. That's one of my big things that I want to make sure I don't have 1,000 things running just sitting there idle. Because even in VS, even an update running that's doing nothing still consumes resources. So you have to make sure you're only running what needs to be run. So, all right, so we're going to move toward vector 2. Oop, that's not what I wanted. I want this position is where we're going to. This is my current position, and we can do time delta time. And if we need to multiply that out, we can. And then we're going to set position. Okay. All right. So, and then once this is equal, once these two are equal, we want to negate this. If this is true and they do equal each other, we are going to despawn this object. Now, this is the proper way to stop an object, is to despawn it. So, all right, because if you destroy it, the network loses the object and it tries to find it on the clients, it doesn't know what to do. All right, so now here's our projectile. Real simple. We're going to move towards this position and over time delta time, blah, 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 blah. All right, so now if we come in here and we take a look back at our player, our projectile is ready. Let's see, we don't need that anymore. And we're going to spawn. So let's take this up and let's see what happens. Let's see, we got two projectiles. They are moving incredibly slow, but we are projectiles, right? So now we do have projectiles. So let's come back in here and let's do a multiply. So let's do it by 3, I would think, so we can get a little bit faster. Okay, so now we're going to be able to fire at any mouse position. Okay, and it's every 0.2 seconds I can fire a projectile. So 10 or 5 per second. Right. So that all works. Looks good. So what we're going to do now is let's come in here and let's add some movement to our player. Get axis. Let's do horizontal. Let's do some vertical. Create vector 2. And what we're going to do is we're going to get my position, just a real simple move script. We're going to add vector 2 to this, and then we are going to, and this one I'll put on update because I don't really want to have to deal with creating a whole thing with on-key stuff. It won't, I mean, it wouldn't take long, but it's just easier to put this on update temporarily. All right, so now now we're super fast. All right, so we're going to, let's take this, divide it. Let's take this by probably 4. Let's take it down to a quarter speed. Nah, still way too fast. Take it divided by 20. There we go. All right, so now we also have, again here, we got to make sure that I'm only going to move my player. So what we're going to do is owner, because otherwise if you move, it's going to try and move everybody else, and you don't want to do that. So it's not, you wouldn't be able to move the other players because you're not the owner of those objects. But if it were a networked object that didn't have a transform component, it will move it. So you only want to make sure. So if you're like pushing around a block or something, and then it sends an RPC, says it's done, and it didn't show up on the other player's side because it doesn't have transform, then you would lose that object somewhere. They'd be out of sync, and you don't want things out of sync. Everything needs to be identical. They have to be identical between the two projects. All right, so here we have this. Okay. Just a real crappy generic thing that I made, right? Let's take this up to like 10. So then I can move around, do whatever. All right. So and then we got our clones. They're disappearing. That's one from earlier. There. There we go. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to save this. I'm going to pop up my other project real quick. Whoop. I did not mean to click that button. All right. So once that's popped up, all right, we can go ahead and run this while that's loading. So we want to take this open up here. I can move over here and just fire away, whatever. So you understand how easy it is to start setting these things up. So the player, the script on this player to set everything up. So this is going to be movement, real generic. Okay. And then this is the script to fire a projectile. And now you can do any number of things you want. So if you have hit points or whatever, and we'll go over that real quick here in a second, you can add those in so that you can start subtracting hit points from the object. And once it hits something. So if we come in here, boop, 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 okay, So here we have our objects. We come back, you see they're synced between the two projects. Just like that. So there you have networked bullets going back and forth between the objects. And like I said, now down here you could use physics here. You could use whatever you want. You may not want to have a script here on the projectile. That's up to you. Everybody's different in how they do things. So you could have the add force right here, and it would just fire the projectile, and away it goes. But typically, I like to have the add force if it were going to be on something, or the move would be on here, because you need to have that ever so slight delay to account for the latency, so that everybody's bullet spawns roughly the same time, so that they look the same. Because if you start coming in and just on start, well, the server is going to immediately start. The other players are going to have a little bit of a latency between half a millisecond or half a, well, maybe, I don't know, probably 50 milliseconds max now to, well, it depends on where you are in the world, I guess, too. But so you get the idea that you kind of want to just have to make sure you account for latency. So now that we have that working, let's come in here. Let's just set up this. I have this other script from earlier, and I want my projectile scripts. And these were those demo vars from my other video. So all I care about this entity int. Oh, that's not what I want. I want to put on player. Goofball. Remove this. I want to put this on the player. On here, I want to take this. I want to start subtracting some hit points. So here we have our entity int, and we have our projectile. And once it hits something, we're going to have to add a couple of colliders. Come here, you. What am I doing? Good Lord. Let's add some circle colliders. And I need a rigid body on this fella here. And we're going to set our gravity scale to 0. That way we can trigger. And once you collide, let's see, we'll just put these both on trigger. So once you interact with each other, we are going to subtract some amount from the player. Okay. So let's go ahead and add. We'll set this to player. And projectile. So we're going to set this to projectile, this to player, and then we got to make sure that we're not going to hit ourselves. So how do we do that? Let's see. We can do the first interaction that the bullet has. But I'm going to do that. Let me. That's. I got it. I know what I can do. Let's do a ignore collider. Ignore collider 2D, right? So now we're going to do the first. No, that's not wrong. It's a once. So once this comes in, we're going to do on trigger enter. So once this triggers the first time, we want to come back here to the player. We want to go ahead and make this the player. So once the projectile hits a player, we're going to make sure that it is a player. We're going to compare tag. We're going to make sure you are a player. If you are a player, and once again, we have to make sure that this is server. Okay, and if this is true. Okay, so the first time we're going to do this, we're going to ignore the collision for this and this. I do believe that's how this should work. And let's go here. We want to make sure that this is the player. Okay, now after this initial contact is made, it should continue to fire without. until I hit another object. So let's take a look at this and make, oh crap, I need to save it. Let's make sure that works like intended, because I don't want to have to do it a million times. So let's take a look real quick. Let's pop her up. Say, all right, we're going to move over to the left a little bit. Come back over here. We're going to rerun this. I want to make sure that our trigger is working. And let's come back over here. And we're going to say this guy here. Okay. And we want to come down to a projectile. Okay. We got our projectiles. The first one was ignored. And I do believe it should ignore it. And then we should be outside of our boundaries. So if it were to bounce off something else eventually later, it would not come back and hit your player. So it's kind of one of those things where it depends on how you have your projectile set up, right? If they're bouncing all over the place, you don't want them to bounce back and hit your player, the one that fired it, because it starts on the inside. It still doesn't ignore the collision. It's going to pick up that first collision as it enters the trigger, and once that happens for the player, you have to make sure that that's ignored. All right, so now we have that ignored. What we want to do is we want to start subtracting. So we're going to say, let's see, what was it? Entity int. So we're going to get the entity int of this object. So we're going to have, this is the player clone. Get game object. We're going to get the object of this, and then we're going to say we're going to subtract. Okay, and we'll just subtract 1 for now, and we're going to set entity int. Go, let's float. Set entity int. Okay, and then so afterward, we're going to do this, and we're coming back down to here. Okay, and we need to make sure we only do this once again, because we don't want to have multiple hits. So we're only going to be coming in, we're going to trigger. The first time it triggers, it's going to say, hey, you're the first one I hit, which is my player. I'm going to ignore you from now on. And then after that, every trigger that comes through is going to test once. If it was a player, it's going to hit it once and then subtract. So it only subtracts for that one time. Okay, so let's file save. Let's give our player some hit points. Let's do 100. Save that again. Run this. And then what we're going to do is we will come back over to here. We're going to refresh this, run again. Come back here. Okay, so now if I'm running around here, oh man, there we go. Did I hit the, oh, right over here. All right, so here's this. We're going to come over here. We're going to fire at the player. And if we see here, I have 98 hit points on this player here. So if I start firing at him, we can see over here, our hit points are dropping. And we come back over here, and we come back over, and we are going to see that our hit points are identical, because these are RPCs being sent on the back end to say, hey, you've changed. We're going to go ahead and update you. So if I do that, see, now we're down to 85 instead of in the 90s. So that is how simple this is. It's really straightforward on how you do most of this stuff. It's one of those things where it just takes a bit to learn, but once you get it down, you're really going to pick it up real quick. So typically, if I wasn't having to explain this, I could do this in like 2 minutes to set something up like this. You know, you just like 2 minutes and you're all set. You got it built, ready to go. You're testing. You just get to the point where you just know what works, and that's it. So this is just the basics on how to do a projectile, networked projectile. If we come in here and we double click, I can put side by side, kind of show you exactly. Let's do this here. So let's see here. They're too small. I can't see them. They're too small. There we go. Oh, shoot myself. There we go. So now we can see the projectiles on both screens, right? So no matter where I point and aim, it's going to fire the projectiles to that position, right? Because that's how we set our script up. So very simple, very straightforward. I think anyone can get the idea on how all this works. Once you start learning this part, the CMD is telling the server, hey, this is the position I had my mouse at, and then the server takes over from there and does everything else. You don't have to do anything special for the client, because what's returned is this value as a sync var. And the sync var is going to be what you will use to display things like hit points. So if you had two little status bars or whatever, you could have one for mana and one for health, and then you can update those every time that changes, and then you have a nice fancy looking whatchamacallit. Anyway, so but that's about it. That's what the goal of this video was, to briefly show how this all works, and hopefully you find this useful. I want to make a bunch more of these just demo type things where people can kind of get the idea of how all this really works and how simple it really is. Multiplayer is a scary thing for a lot of people, but it's very simple once you get going, especially in VS. You don't have to worry about any kind of you don't have to worry about the syntax and things like that, and you don't have to worry about setting stuff up. So, and people need to understand that you can use VS in conjunction with your scripts, right? So I mean, you don't have to be 100% VS, you don't have to be 100% C#. You can use a mix of both. There's nothing wrong with that. You can get all the variables out of these objects once you've done whatever. And I think VS is probably one of the better ways to prototype something. And instead of writing a bunch of code, I'm sure this is probably easy for someone to make in code, but there's some things that aren't quite as easy. And dragging a bunch of lines together real quick to build something is pretty simple in my book. So anyway, all right, have a good one, guys. Stay tuned. I'll put a bunch more videos out here. We'll see you around. All right, bye. In this video,